What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review the new steampunk sci-fi flick Mortal Engines from director Christian Rivers. Christian Rivers is a first-time director, but he's been part of Peter Jackson's inner circle for about 20 years. And Mortal Engines is very much a wingnut movie because it is written by Fran Walsh, Philip Reeve, and Peter Jackson. And they, of course, were the screenwriting trio behind the Lord of the Rings films, the Hobbit films, etc. The movie is based on a book that's the first in a quartet by an author named Philip Reeve. I've never read his novels. So if I say anything cruel or scathing about the movie along the way, please know that it comes from a place of total ignorance of the books. I'm basing my criticism entirely upon what I saw on the screen. The name of the movie actually comes from a line from Shakespeare's Othello, and the author used it because it perfectly describes this dystopian futuristic society where resources are scarce. And we basically have a new world order where these giant city-states on wheels battling it out in this Darwinian fantasy, where basically London is slowly but surely becoming the most powerful city in the world. This world is totally unlike the one that we're familiar with due to what is described as the 60-minute war, total annihilation about 1,000 years ago. And the annihilation was so complete, it even changed the shape of the continents. And now these characters live in a world where almost nothing is known about the past prior to the 60-minute war, except for a few relics of old tech, which people are always hunting down and coveting and trying to learn everything they can from. But while watching this movie, several times I had to fight the impulse to get up and leave. But I was determined to stick it out just out of morbid curiosity, because once upon a time, Peter Jackson was one of my favorite filmmakers. And granted, he's just a writer and producer on this, not the director. But I keep looking for signs or hints that the Peter Jackson that I love and adore might be coming back. Because if you look at his movies from Bad Taste through Return of the King, you basically have low-budget horror films, delightfully deranged splatterfests like Brain Dead. You probably got the best pornographic, violent Muppet movie ever made in Meet the Feebles, an extraordinary art house favorite in Heavenly Creatures. And then, of course, you've got just the majestic grandeur of the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. And when those movies were coming out year after year, I was basically living at the movies, just completely, utterly wallowing in that world. As you can see behind me, I've got a lot of J.R.R. Tolkien behind me. And I was having so much fun when those movies came out. I remember when Two Towers came out, but on the second evening where I went to see it, I had so much fun watching it, I stuck around and watched it again. When Return of the King came out, I saw it 6 times in the theater, and whenever the Riders of Rohan would come into the rescue at the Battle of Pelennor Fields at the end, I would cry each and every time. But in terms of the career story, it just blew my mind that Peter Jackson could slowly but surely graduate through all these different subgenres and low-budget movies to making these kind of movies that really don't get made anymore. Basically, giant crowd-pleasing pieces of entertainment that go on to win like 10, 11, 12 Oscars. When Return of the King came out, it got nominated for 12 Oscars, and it won each and every single one of them. And I can't remember the last time a giant, robust hit that makes like $1 billion worldwide also has the affection and the admiration of the critical establishment. So to see him and his creative team become what they have become, because I absolutely loathed and despised the Hobbit movies, it's been really depressing to me because Mortal Engines is one of my least favorite movies I've seen in the 21st century. If I hadn't seen Jupiter Ascending a couple years ago, I might say this is the worst science fiction film of the 21st century, but I would have to revisit Jupiter Ascending to confirm that, and I'm never revisiting Jupiter Ascending. So let's just say Mortal Engines is bad. And I hate to say that because I genuinely like Christian Rivers, the director, as a person. When all the various DVD packages for the Lord of the Rings were coming out, I watched the special features on a loop over and over and over again. And one of the main people that gets interviewed extensively throughout all 3 of those movies is Christian Rivers. He was one of Peter Jackson's chief collaborative partners on those movies. And I think he deserves a little bit of credit on taking a chance on a new franchise. We live in an era where we get a lot of big franchise movies, but almost all of them are based on something that has been a success in the past. When you're dealing with budgets of this size and scale, people get very risk averse, which is totally understandable. But when it comes to fantasy and science fiction, we need some new fresh ideas, we need some new franchises, and a quartet of steampunk books is a perfect jumping off point. But this is one of those movies where I rejected each and every single detail of the movie, except for one crucial one. In the opening scene, the central character looks really cool. And that's all I can say that's positive about this movie. Hera Hilmar plays a character named Hester Shaw. And in the opening sequence, before we even see the title card of the film, we see a very small mobile trading colony on wheels being pursued by London. And it's a big, elaborate chase scene where basically London, which is the size of a mountain, and the only reason it's called London is because St. Paul's Cathedral's at the top of it, but it's basically a giant tank the size of a mountain. And it's blasting through the landscape and basically destroying everything that it encounters, trying to catch this little teeny tiny vehicle because it's got some resources on it. But this is one of those sci-fi movies where it is so joyless and so humorless, and the spectacle is so empty that no matter how busy and loud the movie gets, you never really feel any real excitement or exhilaration from the spectacle that's on the screen. And the sad reality is the movie shoots its whole wad in the opening scene. That is as good as the movie gets. because in my opinion, one of the most important aspects of any science fiction film, fantasy film, superhero movie, basically any form of escapist entertainment that takes place in an otherworldly environment, the movie needs to have a sense of internal logic that makes sense and that you embrace so that you can basically surrender over to the vision and become a part of the world. When I watch the original Star Wars, I'm not necessarily worried about whether or not the movie's obeying the laws of physics, as long as the rules contained within the story itself are consistent. You could call it suspension of disbelief, you can use whatever expression you like, but this is one of those movies where at every turn, every single detail, I found myself pushing it away at arm's length as opposed to embracing it. And for me, the biggest narrative and logical hurdle that I could not get across was the idea that in a world where resources are scarce, that somehow a system would emerge where people use resources in the least efficient way possible. A perfect example of a dystopian sci-fi movie that gets all that right is Mad Max Fury Road. From the moment Mad Max Fury Road begins to the moment it ends, I was completely, totally absorbed into that world, loved everything about it, was absolutely riveted, was absolutely fascinated. And in terms of the DNA of the environment, Mortal Engines actually does have a lot in common with the Mad Max world. Perhaps if the movie's tone were less serious, then I could have bought this idea of these giant cities moving around like tanks. Like if you watch Monty Python and the Meaning of Life, the opening scene before the movie even really gets started is of these office buildings basically acting like pirates going to war with each other, and it's completely, totally ridiculous, but you cackle wildly while you watch it. If Mortal Engines had even a shred of humor, just even an ounce of humor, perhaps I could have just gone along for the ride. But this movie has a huge, giant stick up its butt and takes itself incredibly seriously. But the biggest glaring flaw of this movie by far is the fact that the characters fall into two categories. You've got your incredibly bland, forgettable, interchangeable, just non-entities. And then you've got your characters that are just flat out intensely unlikable. To her credit, Hera Hilmar does the best that she can with the material that's given to her, and the material that's given to her is not particularly good. But the Achilles heel of this movie is actor Robert Sheehan, who plays the character Tom Natsworthy. I almost felt like I was watching sketch comedy where somebody was trying to write the most generic, prissy, fastidious, just overall annoying English stereotype ever committed to film. He's basically there to ask a lot of stupid questions in every single scene so that the other characters around him can provide the answers that we, the audience, need to know. It's incredibly clumsy, exposition-heavy dialogue. And then to make matters much worse, in the final third, this movie just starts stealing from Star Wars willy-nilly. If you've seen Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, you'll be shocked and amazed at the audacity of this movie of just how many scenes, scenarios, and little character beats that get ripped right from those movies. In the giant climax of the movie, you basically have London lumbering toward this enormous wall. And this wall basically protects all of Asia from these giant city-states because on the other side of the wall, people live in traditional settlements. And in a last-ditch effort to stop London, they send out a couple fighters to bring it down. And from the way the action is staged, from the way it's cutting between the various pilots, from the way they interact and talk to each other, to the way they attack London, it is a carbon copy of the finale of the original Star Wars from 1977. At one point, the hero, Hester Shaw, she's throwing down the main villain of the movie, Thaddeus Valentine, played by Hugo Weaving. And as they're having this epic battle to the death, he basically pulls lines straight out of the finale of Empire Strikes Back, where, no joke, he tells her, "I am your father." The only thing they don't steal is having Hester Shaw scream, "That's not true, that's impossible." But it's something that adds almost nothing to the movie, apart from the fact that anyone who's ever seen Empire Strikes Back is just going to laugh out loud when they see that scene. And the character Tom Natsworthy, much like Luke Skywalker, all he's ever wanted in his life is to be a pilot. He's been trapped in the engine rooms of London his whole life, but now he's finally getting a chance to fly. And of course it's Tom Natsworthy who flies into the guts of London toward the end to try to shut down the engine. And in a scene that's identical to the end of Return of the Jedi, he disables the engine and goes flying out of the city as it explodes behind him, much like the Death Star. It is completely, totally ridiculous. And if you're making a science fiction movie for general audiences, I think it's a safe assumption that the majority of them have probably seen Star Wars. It's probably even safer to assume that a lot of them love Star Wars. So I don't know what they were thinking when they committed those scenes to film. In any event, I can feel myself getting worked up, and I don't want this review to turn mean. It's probably already turned a little bit mean. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a nice little ribbon on this and say, I intensely dislike this movie. It's one of my least favorite science fiction movies of the 21st century. They get a huge A+ for effort for at least trying to break new ground and build a new franchise out of nothing. But in terms of execution, they absolutely get an F. When it comes to video games, comics, TV, and film, we're kind of living in a golden age of science fiction with a lot of cool stuff to choose from. So if you're going to make a sci-fi movie, you absolutely better bring your A game. And at some point, Peter Jackson's just going to have to figure out how to fall in love with movies again. I don't know what happened to him. But right around the time of King Kong, suddenly he seems to just completely checked out and just started phoning everything in. And it absolutely breaks my heart because of all the filmmakers throughout my life that I've ever been a huge fan of, I've never had a complete, total reversal in my opinion of the work, quite like I've had with Peter Jackson. So on that sour note, I'm going to wrap this video up. Hope you enjoyed this reaction and review. If you made it this far, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Usually I try to focus on the positive and review shows and movies that I love, but after having endured this movie this evening, I just had to get a few things off my chest. But if you want to talk more about Peter Jackson or science fiction, you can find me on Twitter at Colbrax. But I can't thank you enough for watching my video. I really appreciate the support, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.